Garden State GSCLE. 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 Garden State GSCLE.
All right, here we go. You ready?
All set.
All right, you sure? I want to make sure we're going.
I'm ready.
All right, Kevin, tell everybody your true and legal name.
Kevin Riechelson from the firm Kaminsky, Cohen and Riechelson.
And you're an attorney at law.
Attorney at law.
Licensed to practice in?
Pennsylvania and New Jersey.
Which is the better state?
Depends where I am at the time.
Actually, it's a trick question because Pennsylvania is a Commonwealth. And Brian.
Brian Murphy from Kaminsky, Cohen and Riechelson.
Are you the same Brian Murphy who lives in Washington Crossing, Pennsylvania?
That is
All right, I
correct.
just want to check. There's a million Brian Murphys out there. You know that, right?
Yes, I do.
Now, we're here today to talk about a discrete topic, and it's one that you have tremendous expertise in. You have a little bit of experience in these things, too. But I really want you to be here from the insurance company perspective, okay?
Okay.
You're obviously an insurance company guy in defense attorney's clothes.
Well, I have a defense background, 17 years of doing defense work, but I've been doing plaintiff's work for about 7 years now.
Did you go over to the dark side or to the green side?
Depends who you ask.
I'm going to ask you what your wife says.
Defense people say I went to the dark side. The plaintiffs say I was on the dark side, now I'm on the good side.
All right. I have 1,000 questions, so let me just kind of take them one step at a time. The first is, in your experience, is there any distinction in kind of categorizing nursing home versus assisted living complexes? Are they really the same thing, or do you approach these types of cases differently?
Approach them much the same way. Nursing home litigation, that is cases, dealing with nursing home abuse and neglect, have an advantage because you have certain regulations and statutes that support you here in the state of New Jersey, whereas assisted living facilities not so much governed by the regulations, but the concept's the same. It's custodial care.
Right.
You got an individual who enters a facility because they need support and help. There is less need. There's not a skilled nursing care required of an individual who's in assisted living. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be, maybe in certain instances, a more challenging case.
What about a situation where the assisted living facility has a component, let's say for Alzheimer's patients, okay? In other words, they have a normal assisted living area for maybe, 100 or 150 people or families. And then they have a locked ward, so to speak, where the Alzheimer's patients, or residents, I guess they would be called, are. Would they technically be come under the rubric of a nursing home under those circumstances?
Yeah, under those circumstances, I think you've got a strong case because they're receiving skilled nursing care. Okay. They may actually be in an assisted living facility in some kind of a lockdown unit,
right.
But these are not individuals, those that are suffering from Alzheimer's or severe dementia, that are able to conduct their day-to-day activities without the assistance of skilled nursing care. So
if you had somebody who had some complaint of mistreatment that was in an assisted living complex, but the individual was, let's say, an Alzheimer's patient who was confined to a locked ward, and let's say there was some abuse or an elopement or something like that, would you handle that case like you would handle a nursing home case?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very much so.
And would you say that the regulations would probably be the same?
I'd make the argument that they are, and that they're applicable.
Now, just I want to give some practical advice to the non-attorneys who are kind of watching this. Let's say it's a family, and I want to give you some scenarios and see how you would advise the family. Let's go back to the Alzheimer's patient, okay? Someone who is very rapidly losing his or her mind, and they've come to you for advice. What is the best solution for long-term care for this individual for the rest of his or her life? What would you recommend, based on your own experience?
For an individual who has
Alzheimer's or dementia.
When I talk to people about their loved ones going into a nursing home, that are in a nursing home, sometimes I get calls from individuals who have concerns where there has not yet been neglect or a significant injury of sorts, but there's some concern on behalf of the family and they're looking for guidance. I always tell them what you need to have for your individual loved one is as much hands-on care as possible. Skilled nursing homes and assisted living facilities, for that matter as well, will not always have someone assigned to an individual, and they're not going to for 24 hours a day. They're going to have them there, but those individuals, say those nurses' aides, are going to be responsible for caring for anywhere from 10 on up.
10 residents?
Yeah, 8 to 10 residents in a facility that's properly staffed, but then it grows from there, and you run into issues where there's fewer staff, and when there's fewer staff, that's where the neglect often rears its head.
Sure, Kevin.
One of the things about looking at nursing homes is there's a lot of information available through the internet, or there's surveys that you can go and you can look at, and you can find out whether the nursing home's been cited, whether there are violations.
Cited in the sense that there's been some kind of disciplinary action taken by the state.
Right, and the surveys will tell you what the ratio is of caregivers to residents. It'll give you all kinds of information, so you want to do your homework before you put somebody into a facility to make sure that it's not a facility that's been cited numerous times, or we all know the problems that can arise. You want to make sure that this isn't a place where it's been seen a lot in the past.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions then. I mean, in your own experience, what would you say is an acceptable ratio of staff to patients or staff to residents?
Under the federal regulations, the standard is you have to have sufficient staff to meet the needs of the residents.
Right.
Any facility that doesn't have sufficient staff to meet the needs of the residents is failing. And that's really on a case-by-case analysis.
But in your experience, would you say that's 4 to 1 or 5 to 1 or 8 to 1 or something of that nature? I mean, is there something that just based on your own experience you could say is probably a good ratio, or is it there are too many variables involved?
Well, I had mentioned 8 to 10 is typical, but that also depends too. It depends on the type of care that's being provided to those different residents. So if you've got a CNA who's responsible for 8 to 10 residents.
And the CNA is what?
I'm sorry, certified nurse's aide.
Okay.
All right, certified nurse's aide does the lion's share of the work in a skilled nursing facility, or an ALF for that matter. They're doing a lot of the hands-on day-to-day care. They're doing the bathing, they're doing the feeding, they're addressing all hygiene issues, they're getting them ready for bed, they're getting them out of bed.
Sounds like being married.
So if you've got, like you said before, someone who's suffering from Alzheimer's, right? If you've got a CNA who's providing that type of care on a regular basis to 8 to 10 Alzheimer's residents, that's a lot. That's a lot for that individual to handle. So, but if you have a CNA who's providing for 8 to 10 residents who are really quite independent and able to get up and ambulate on their own without assistance, able to toilet on their own without assistance, then certainly it's doable.
Okay. And what about other higher staff members, like regular nurses or RNs, or how quickly a physician can be there if necessary? Do you look to that as well?
I do look at the hands-on care of the nurses, how much they're there. The physicians typically are not there on a regular basis. The physicians are primarily responding to and relying upon the nurses and what the nurses are reporting to them, and then the physicians will come in. But typically in a skilled nursing facility, physicians are not there regularly.
What about staffing levels around the clock, in the sense we're dealing with a 7-day-a-week, 24-hour-a-day operation? Is it acceptable to have staffing levels decrease in the nighttime, for example, when people are supposed to be asleep?
Yeah, and they typically do. They'll decrease a bit in the nighttime because there's less activity in the nighttime.
Right.
But still, you need to have someone who's there and available and checking on the residents on a regular basis.
Now, let me throw a question out to both of you. Supposing you have a substandard person there, in other words, an individual who has propensity of violence, maybe a criminal record that wound up being not found or expunged or something of that nature. To what extent is that a liability for these individuals, especially when it turns out that, let's say, they perpetrate some act of violence against a resident? Does that provide any additional cause of action? For they negligently employed this person or something like that?
Yeah, those types of things are looked into as well, and are often pled in cases that I have. Negligent hiring, negligent supervision might be another one.
Right.
But certainly there are background checks that are done for all the nurse aides and the nurses that are coming into the facility, and those are things that are looked at, and if they come up over the course of the litigation, that's something that is...
One of the things that you look at when you're talking about negligence is the standard of knew or should have known, where you have somebody with a history you absolutely should know that that person has that history, and if it's a violent history, they shouldn't be around the patients.
Okay, so there's really there's no point in them being there in the first place because...
Well, if somebody gets picked up on a minor charge and it has nothing to do with the care of elderly people, that's one thing. But if you have someone who has done something, like I said, violent or of a sexual nature or something like that, you absolutely don't want that person around these residents.
So this is an enormous responsibility then for the hiring people at these facilities. In other words, they've got to make sure of the bona fides of the people that they're hiring to come in and take care of the patients, right?
Absolutely.
And do you find that on occasion that doesn't happen?
It does. On occasion, it does not happen.
Right. And I would imagine that, I mean, I can't see why a case like that would go to trial. I mean, it's such an obvious, indication of negligence.
The vast majority of the cases settle.
They do? Okay. Now, apart from criminal background checks, what other things would you be looking or concerned about with the staff that's going to be there? I mean, the bona fides of their training and things of that nature, are you concerned about that?
Sure, competence, the extent of their training, what kind of training they received once they got to the facility. Typically, at nursing homes, there are in-service programs, sort of similar to continuing legal education for attorneys.
Right.
There's continuing legal education for the licensed nurses, the LPNs, the RNs, and they have to be in-service on different things. The CNAs, the Certified Nurses Assistants, too, are also in-service and continuously being trained on things. You take a look at that kind of stuff. So what do they come in with? What kind of qualifications did they have when they were hired? And then what kind of education were they receiving as they were going through their employment?
What about let me just get this one question.
Okay.
What about supervision? In the sense that you have these people there, they're working there, but if they're not properly led, managed, and supervised, that could also be a problem.
Yeah, and it's often something that's pled in these complaints because the RNs and the LPNs are responsible for supervising the nurses' aides.
Right. And how many, let's say it's an LPN, how many LPNs would you say should be responsible for a number of nurses' aides? Is it like 1 to 4, 1 to 5, or?
Yeah, they have about that. You usually have a handful of nurses' aides that are being supervised by one nurse.
Okay, and ultimately it's the one nurse who's responsible for their activities, right? I mean, she's really the kind of the manager / leader of these individuals, right?
Correct.
Okay, so it's her responsibility to make sure that ultimately that the patients are being well cared for.
Yes.
And
Yeah, one of the things that I'm working with Brian on these cases that I've seen that he's picked up on a lot is that the nurses or whoever's taking care of the patients are not actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, and then that leads to false charting. They put information in the chart that they did something that they actually didn't do, and that's another one of those situations where you can turn that against them and show that they were providing substandard care or no care at all. In fact, recently we worked on a case together where Brian found that the patient wasn't even in the facility on days where there's charting showing that certain care or certain medication was given to the patient. And that's just, besides the fact that it's false charting, it's very embarrassing for the facility if this were to come out in deposition or later on in a trial when they're saying we're giving the best care available, and we tell them, well...
How can that facility even keep its license, though, something so egregious as that?
That would probably depend on whether or not Medicare or Medicaid is auditing them to find out whether if they're paying the bill, whether the patient was actually there. Because there should be some overlap with, assuming the patient was in the hospital or some out of the facility, there should be something to match up to show that they were somewhere else at the time and shouldn't be paying the bill for services they never got.
Are these places generally self-insured, or do they have the conventional liability policies?
I think it's a mixture.
It's kind of a mix. Yeah, you do have insurance policies. The policies are usually about $1 million policy.
It's not a lot.
No, and then they have, and then some have excess coverage on top of that, and there's often a self-insured reduction.
Got it. So do you find, and this is really a question for you more than anything else because you are devious, there's no doubt about it, do you find that the insurance companies are insisting that the nursing homes take steps to protect themselves in the sense of like having cameras, security cameras and things of that nature to actually show the interaction with the patients? Have you found that?
No, because of HIPAA laws.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so
Wow.
there's not, and I seek that in discovery if there's
Right.
any kind of, you got a fall case. you want to know if there are any cameras anywhere. And sometimes there are cameras placed at entrances.
Right.
But certainly not throughout the facility. I haven't found it. I've had numerous times requested it, and it's been denied as just something that they do not.
In the past couple of years, you might have seen on television that some of the biggest cases are cases where the family member thinks that there's an abuse going on or neglect going on, and they actually put a camera
surreptitiously.
Yes, in their loved one's room,
Right.
and they've caught abuse, they've caught all kinds of things on camera, and it's led to criminal charges and also to pretty big civil settlements and verdicts.
Well, I don't see how there could be a verdict. Those cases should never go to trial. I mean, can you imagine a jury looking at somebody being beaten in his bed or things of that nature, the horrible abuse that goes on that's caught on camera?
There are situations, though, where the family wants the case to go to trial. They want everything out in the open, because a lot of times if cases settle, there's not a lot of publicity over it, or there could be a confidentiality agreement. If it goes to trial, everything's out in the open.
Right. Wow. Have you run into one of those yet, by the way, where the family was surreptitiously...
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes, I have.
And what did the videotape reveal?
Slapping.
It's awful, awful stuff. Typically, what is the type of abuse that you've seen in most of the cases? I mean, there's going to be extreme cases. I know we had one in New Jersey involving a scalding or something of that nature. Do you remember that case?
No.
Well, actually, it either went to the appellate division of the Supreme Court. Fairly recent case, and the issue in that case was the person had a propensity for violence in her past that had not been picked up upon, and they hired her anyway, and she wound up almost killing the patient. But in your own practice, what do you see normally as the run-of-the-mill in the run-of-the-mill abuse case?
Run-of-the-mill abuse case. Well, typically the injuries I find are bed sores, being probably first and foremost. Good number of bed sore cases, and then there are a good number of fall cases as well.
Well,
those neglect cases really depends on how you define abuse, really, because some of them certainly teeter on abuse. Physical abuse I've seen verbal abuse, physical abuse, slapping, hitting, punching, cutting. I have seen dignity issues, a lot of
what do you mean by
deprivation.
dignity issues?
Allowing a person to remain for a prolonged period of time in lying in their own feces, unchanged. Many of the clients that I have, the residents were incontinent, had diapers, and would be left for extended periods of time. Now, those are often bed sore cases.
You have to ask yourself, just as an outsider, as a layperson, how is this possible? How could this be? I mean, with the standards that are supposed to be in place in these areas and the attention that these individuals are supposed to get, how could you possibly have a dignity issue? How could you possibly have a bed sore issue if people are doing their jobs?
Well, that's the problem. You don't have the people doing their jobs, and often it's a situation where you don't have enough people doing the jobs. And you have, like I said, the nurses' aides doing the lion's share, and the nurses' aides aren't being paid very well, frankly. And you have an overall feeling in some of these nursing homes, not all, but in a good number of these nursing homes, it's a difficult work environment.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. Dealing with very difficult, needy people.
Yes, and it's a challenge. It's a hard work for a nurse aide to do what they do every day.
Right.
And then to accompany that with a large number of residents where they can't possibly get everything done that they need to get done. When you have, I mean, a nursing home is run like any other business, but there's a problem with that because they're not manufacturing widgets here. They're protecting and they're caring for the most vulnerable in our society. And when you have a corporation that owns a nursing home that's interested first and foremost in making large profits, and the number one thing they do when they come in is they take a look at their number one cost.
Which is staff.
And their number one cost is staffing.
Well, isn't there some governmental agency that kind of does this and can conduct like random inspections and things like that? Something equivalent to DIFAS, basically.
Yes, under the federal regulations, it's really under federal law, but implemented on the state level. You have the Department of Health for each state. Now, I practice in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and Department of Health in both of those states conduct surveys. They conduct one annual survey that's mandatory, and that goes on at some time during the year. And then they will come in and conduct surveys when notified of a particular issue. And what they'll do is they'll send in individuals, And those individuals, those state employees, will go in and they'll review records, they'll speak with the staff, they'll speak with the director of nursing, the administrator, and investigate what the complaint was. And if they find, upon having those discussions and reviewing those records and meeting with the resident, that a violation has occurred, a violation of the regulations, then the facility will be cited for it.
Do you think that it would be helpful if the legislature were to enact some type of regulation, or the legislature wouldn't do it, but let's say the Department of Health would promulgate a regulation saying, look, if you're going to conduct this kind of business, you must have X number of aides to a certain number of patients, depending upon the level. Let's say for Alzheimer's patients, for the sake of argument, you've got to have at least one nurse's aide for every 4 Alzheimer's patients, or something of that nature. So that it's irrespective of what the corporation wants to do to try to cut down on costs. It's required. You have to have this level of staffing for this type of person. Do they have anything like that?
They don't. It's just a lot more vague than that. It doesn't.
Is that a result of lobbying by some type of lobbying organization, to prevent this?
I would
from happening?
imagine it is, but I don't know for certain. I know that I rely on the federal regulations that say you need to staff to meet the needs of the residents, and then if it comes down
kind of
to
vague, though, isn't it?
How do you meet the needs, right? And there is also, each state you have a patient per day ratio, a number that is formulated through a formula, but that's not representative of exactly how many staff need to be providing care for the residents on that day, because the needs of the residents change, and this is why it's tricky. The needs of the residents change. I mean, you got residents coming in and out at different levels of acuity. So you have some who really need care and need longer time spent with them, and some who need shorter. And so that's why it's difficult to legislate that specific issue any more than it already has been.
Well, do you think that the state, though, is lax in terms of the supervision of these facilities? In other words, that they should be out there all the time, inspecting them constantly?
Well, they're out there often enough. I think the state can only do so much. I think it's a highly regulated area. I rely
But if
upon
we're successfully regulated, you guys would be doing automobile personal injury instead of this. And it sounds to me like this is an extremely important part of the plaintiff's bar.
If I could, if it could be more regulated, if they could tighten the regulations, that would be terrific. I don't see that happening. It is highly regulated, and I think at some point, regardless of the industry, you can have a lot of regulation, but ultimately you need litigation as well.
Right.
Bob, one of the other things that you have to remember is if you look at other regulated industries, there's not enough inspectors to go around and regulate them. You look at the restaurant industry. I think they say an average restaurant is inspected every 3 to 5 years.
Right.
You have the fire marshal or licensing and inspection in Pennsylvania that's supposed to go around and check fire codes and things like that. There's not enough people to check these things. So unless there's a complaint or something brought to their attention, they're not just going to come out randomly and do that. They have their once a year review that they do, but they're not going to come in on an off day and just see what the staffing levels are or whether the patients are being taken care of properly.
I think there's another issue, too, and again, this just thinking off the top of my head, and it's really related to economics. It's a supply and demand situation. We mentioned before that this is very difficult, stressful, dirty work. And the people who who do this, I mean, listen, I have the greatest respect for them. I'm sure they're very dedicated for the most part. But these are not particularly well-educated people. And if they had better options to get a better job, I'm sure they would do it. There's a lot of things you can do that are a lot more pleasant than being a nurse's assistant. You all agree with me?
Yes.
So you may get individuals who are not as responsible, as well-educated, and as well-motivated as they should be for taking on a job at this level of responsibility. And it sounds like just a miserable, stressful job. I mean, am I overstating the case here?
No.
Not at all.
Okay. So part of the problem, I would think, is you get a quality of staff. It's hard to find people to do this kind of work, and you kind of have to settle for people that are they're just not as sharp as they should be. I guess that's the best way to say
Yeah, well,
it.
the issue becomes, though, that there's often a big push by the nursing home administrator, by corporate, to fill those beds.
Of course.
All right, so they got to keep those beds filled to near to maximum capacity, if
Sure.
not maximum capacity. And then that requires more staff. There could be less of a push in that regard. You might be scrambling less in order to find the qualified, well-trained staff to provide the care.
Right, but I'm sure that, look, their goal is to keep themselves between 95 and 100%, capacity, because
Sure.
There's people dying all the time. I mean, that's just the way it goes. They die and they have to be replaced, and or they go to another facility or whatever. But it's usually that they're just going to pass away through natural causes, and they have to be replaced. If you don't do that, you're going to be out of business eventually, right?
Yep.
What I'd like you guys to do is to take me through the typical case, and starting off with, how do the clients find their way to your law firm, and know that you're the guys to go see? How's that happen?
Advertising.
Advertising?
Yeah, we market on the internet. We market, the firm markets different ways in the area. We've had billboards. I have a lot of referrals.
It's mainly
that
through the
come our way.
website, though.
But through the website as well.
And just tell me a little bit about your website. How are you trying to appeal to people out there? Do you say, for example, do you have a loved one in some type of facility? Do you suspect there's some type of abuse or neglect or something like that? And is that the position you take?
Yes.
In other words, are you looking for people in the investigatory stage of the case?
I'm looking for, and I market towards people who think that maybe something's going on here, or they know that an injury has just occurred and they need some help. So I'm marketing toward people that are suspecting that nursing home abuse or neglect has occurred.
So basically, when they come to see you, you have to make an initial evaluation as to whether or not there's, I don't want to use the word probable cause, but certainly enough evidence there to warrant you investing your time to do a much more thorough investigation. Do you agree?
Yeah, I'm looking into, injury.
Right.
What's the? I get a good number of calls. I get quite a few calls, and the calls that I get range. Sometimes people are just coming in or they're just giving me a call because they're unhappy, but it doesn't amount to anything quite yet. They may have witnessed some neglect. They certainly probably have good reason to be upset with certain aspects of the treatment that their loved one has received. Maybe dignity issues,
Right.
Things like that. But it hasn't amounted to an action that I would be able to bring on their behalf.
And sometimes I think a lot of the calls happen when the loved one is taken to a hospital where the family member hasn't been kept apprised of what's going on. They go to the hospital and all of a sudden they're told that they have a bed sore, or they're malnourished, or they're dehydrated,
Or infection or whatever.
Right. And and this even happens when people have visited the facility on a regular basis, but they're not told that mom has this kind of problem or that kind of problem, and all of a sudden it hits critical stage and they're in the hospital.
Right. So, a couple of issues. Number one, wouldn't you say, because I think bed sores is an outrageous situation, because to me it should really be per se negligence. I mean, it's really this. What is there to debate when somebody has bed sores? Really, what is the problem here?
Well,
what is the legal issue or the factual issue?
You mean the defense? Is that what you're asking? What
exactly.
the defense to a bed sore is?
It should be a per se negligence case, I would think.
Not in all instances, but in the vast majority, bed sores are avoidable.
Of course.
But there are those instances when they're not. By way of example, someone who has peripheral vascular disease and develops a pressure ulcer on their heel. It's not going to be a case I'm going to pursue. I've spoken to physicians on numerous occasions about that, and the vascular issues and the complexity of what's going on with the blood flow to the lower extremities at that point makes those bed sores very defensible.
I'm talking about things, though, where there's a causation. In other words, that the bed sores are clearly the result of neglect.
Yeah.
Okay. It just seems to me that should be not even a closed case, because if they were doing their jobs, this would not have developed. I mean, that's the argument that I see.
Correct.
But then you have others that are much more nuanced. You have a fall. Well, a fall can be for 50,000 different things, and it's much more difficult when there's no videotape there. You can exercise a reasonable amount of care, and the patient still falls down. I mean, you would agree with that, would you not?
Fall can be challenging. You got to take a look at assessments. All residents who come into a facility initially are assessed, and they're assessed for fall risk.
Right.
And you have to take a look at that. Once they're assessed for a fall risk, let's say they're determined to be at risk of high fall,
High risk of fall.
Yeah, high
If
risk.
they fall too high, it's for
That's true.
when you're dealing with a
That's
homicide.
another issue. But if they're at high risk for fall, then a care plan has to be drafted in accordance with that assessment. And they have to take proper precautions, and there have to be proper interventions, and then those interventions have to be implemented. You know, I have a case right now where it's a fall case, and it's being litigated, and I discovered recently during the litigation process that the care plan called for a wheelchair and or a walker in the room with the resident. Well, there was none at the time of the fall. There was I've got the nurses admitting there was no wheelchair or walker. There was no assisted
But was that something that
device.
it was just not communicated to the nurses' aides to have that there? Or?
No, that was communicated. That was not only assessed, it was in the care plan, it was in other documents as well, and those nurses rely heavily on the care plan and other documents to communicate from shift to shift as to what is necessary.
These are, as you said, these are difficult cases. I'm really kind of thinking about just the idea of causation, generally speaking, as you know, from the plaintiff's perspective. And you're dealing many times, especially with Alzheimer's patients and people with dementia, that are really not going to be very helpful in their own cases when you're dealing with specific injuries. I just want to know, you know, how do you go about proving causation in these cases?
The records. The records is where you establish it, really. I mean, you get a bed sore case, a
Right.
stage 4 bed sore case. You go right to the development of that wound and just prior to it. What were they doing? Again, going back to assessing. Were they assessing the skin in this
Right.
instance? Were they properly assessing it? Did they care plan? What were the interventions? Did they implement those interventions? And the records will tell you the story.
What about in a dignity case? Same situation,
Well,
records?
dignity is usually something that's coupled in with another injury, an anchoring injury of sorts. So, you know, dignity often arises. I plead it in many of my cases, but it comes in a bed sore case.
Okay.
It come in a fall case.
What about things like abuse, you know, yelling, screaming, slapping, that type of thing? What are typically the proofs that you get for something like that?
Well, if you're fortunate enough to have it on video, terrific. But usually it's eyewitness accounts, family members who are there at the time,
Wow.
who are witnessing something.
Any conscientious employee type situations also? Do you get conscientious employee type
Yes.
situations coming, you know?
You do. I'll spend actually what if you've got a current employee, it's unlikely that they're going to tell you anything that's terribly helpful for you.
Right.
However, I spend a good deal of my time sometimes trying to locate and obtain testimony from employees that are no longer at the facility, because that can be an eye-opening experience.
Do you find it helpful to use investigators for that purpose?
Yes.
In other words, you'll get the information about all the past employees in the discovery, and then send investigators out to find these people and interview them?
Correct.
Okay. And what about the records? Are they usually forthcoming with the records, or do they try to dissemble and hide them and burn them? And
Definitely have run into many issues where records are not given to me in complete form. I specifically request them with the initial letter that I send to the facility. What I typically get in pre-suit is different than what I get later on in litigation.
so is there any useful purpose to be served by trying to work these cases out ahead of time, or is it better just to file your lawsuit immediately and go from there? What do you think?
I keep my options open at all times. I always approach it with my clients and I say, look, we can engage in this. I can send a letter out. You're now represented. And I always leave the door of opportunity open. At any time you can negotiate a case. I've negotiated cases pre-suit and settled them. I've negotiated them early on in litigation, and I've taken them all the way to trial. So at any time.
There are some advantages and disadvantages to waiting. One of the things that Brian faces a lot of times is the Medicare lien or Medicaid lien. So you have the issue of having to get the Medicare lien, getting everything in place, and that takes a long time. However, we have issues where Medicare will only lien you for the amount of medical bills that are associated with the particular injury that you're suing for. However, if the resident dies before the case is resolved, Medicare will impose what's called the super lien, that's what we call it, where they want everything back that they paid out. So by waiting on, you may have the client die, and that just complicates matters further. So there is a balancing act that if you have a client or a patient who is in really poor health, it may not pay to wait. You might want to do it as quickly as possible so that you don't face that super lean situation.
I think that's an enormously important point for the attorneys who are watching this. One of the other ones I wanted to just ask you, again, this is a practical question. If you're going to have problems with a particular facility, do you think it might be a good idea to move the patient from that facility someplace else and then go after whatever cause of action you have? Or it really doesn't matter at this point, you can leave the patient in the facility that you're litigating matters with? What's your advice on that?
I've done it both ways, actually. I mean, typically, a lot of my clients have passed by the time we began litigating the cases, but those that are alive, I just settled a case not long ago where the gentleman remained in the facility.
Right.
It's a concern that sometimes is raised by the clients because the clients feel there might be some kind of retribution.
Or retaliation against them.
I actually have found quite the opposite. Once you get to the point of attorneys getting involved in the facility and the care being provided to an individual, the facility and the care providers at that facility typically do not want to make a bad situation worse. And so there's actually a heightened level of care often in those circumstances.
Can we talk about the causation? And I want to talk about in the context of homicides, where there has been a death, and you feel that it's related to some type of abuse or neglect. All right. How do you go about establishing causation? In other words, I don't know that these cases, if the guy dies in the hospital, normally I don't know that there would be any autopsy. But is the type of thing where you'd suggest a private autopsy or something of that nature? In other words, to tie in the cause of death with some type of abuse or neglect? What are your thoughts on that? On occasion, clients have come to me and inquired about autopsies. There was one or two cases that I've handled where the state has conducted an autopsy. Mm-hmm. But other than that, I mean, I'm chiefly running off of a death certificate and the hospital records. But most of the time you're not going to have an autopsy to show what the official cause of death was? No. In most cases, I don't have a private autopsy done. But I mean, would you find that that might be helpful in certain cases? Again, I'm just trying to think for the broad spectrum of attorneys who are watching this. If you suspect that there was a relationship between the death and some type of abuse or neglect, that there be an autopsy done so that you can tie the two of them together? It might depend on what the death certificate says, because we've had situations where the death certificate does mention the stage 4 bed sore, or the we had a wrongful death case not long ago where somebody basically drowned in their own, they had fluid in the lungs and drowned from that. Mm-hmm. And the autopsy, it wasn't an autopsy report, but the coroner's report did confirm that. So unless the defendant was going to go out and try to find some other cause of death, I would leave it at that. Mm-hmm. Generally speaking, what is the cause of death for most of your patients? Is it just, I mean, is there, do you find that there frequently is a relationship, a causal relationship between the death and the abuse, or is it just something that just happens naturally and that they're just unrelated to each other? I'm not suggesting there isn't a cause of action, it's just that the death was a collateral issue. No, often it's there's a relationship there. Mm-hmm. Often, I mean, I'll find bed sore as a contributing factor to death. The fall being a contributing factor. What is the primary cause of death for these individuals? So is it normally going to be, say, pneumonia or COPD or some type of cancer or something of that nature? Pulmonary issues. Pulmonary? Yeah, that's fairly common. Okay, so I guess you throw in pneumonia with pulmonaries is probably what you're dealing with. Pneumonia, you'll see sometimes pneumonia might be a basis. How did the individual contract the pneumonia? I mean, that might be something worthwhile to investigate. Right. How long did the person have it? Right. What type of medication? Did the person get to see a doctor? Right.
And the case I was mentioning where the guy drowned in, his lungs kept filling up. He had pneumonia and they weren't treating it properly. In fact, by the time he got to the hospital,
it was too late.
One of his lungs was completely filled. They drained, what was it, 60-something ounces of fluid out of it.
How does that happen in the absence of the most egregious negligence? How does something like that happen?
Well, remember what Brian was saying before. There's not a doctor on staff at these places.
But they should be. Somebody should have enough brains to pick up the phone and call a doctor.
They'll say, they'll check the breathing, and they'll say there's a rattle, there's a this, there's a that. But they're not sending them. My client who ended up dying, just before they took him to the hospital, they said to his sister, his x-ray was no different than it was the week before, so we decided to take him to the hospital. And my question was, if it was bad enough to go to the hospital now, why didn't they send him to the hospital a week ago? And then he got to the hospital, and within a day, he deteriorated to the point where he was unconscious and died within the week.
I'm just wondering what kind of radiologist looked at that pulmonary study.
The radiologist isn't really responsible for any of that. The radiologist is just looking at a picture and telling you what the picture shows.
Right.
They're not telling you how to treat it. They're not doing anything. They're just giving you the snapshot and saying, okay, his lung is filled with fluid, the other lung is clear or filled as well. That's all they're saying. And then somebody's got to take that diagnosis or that reading and go further with it.
Wow. What about other types of neglect in the sense of where the people really should be getting medical? I'm thinking about dental, undiagnosed cancers and things of that nature. Do you run into that once in a while?
I have. Oral hygiene is a fairly common issue. It goes hand in hand with short staffing, neglect, and just people not getting the type of care that they signed on for and that they were entitled to and that the nursing home promised. And some of that is daily oral care, oral hygiene care.
I guess you can make a pretty strong argument to a jury about greed and corporate greed and things of that nature. But I mean, as a practical matter, do you see that as a legitimate problem, which is kind of, going to the detriment of the patients,
Yes.
to the residents? That it really is greed-driven, so to speak?
It is at the heart of the issues that we're talking about here. It is something that is pled in all of my cases, and it is something that I will take to a jury, and I think it is at the root. Is it the cause for every single injury that happens in a nursing home? No. I can't say that it is, but bed sore cases where people are, bed sores happen over a course of time.
Sure.
Right? And it's not a one incident issue. It's not one person coming in and screwing something up and it happening. This is happening with a wide variety of nurses and nurse aides. It's happening over a prolonged period of time, and you can see that the training and the supervision is not there. And it's the nursing homes. Often, some of these nursing homes they're ripe for neglect, and it goes right to the corporate issue.
Can we talk about experts for a couple seconds? Because it seems to me that you really need two kinds of experts. Number one, experts going to be able to talk about what the acceptable standard of care is, so that you can kind of have some evidence about the breach. And then the second one I would talk about, I'd want to have an expert about causation if that was in play.
Right.
Can we talk about the experts that will provide evidence on these two issues? First of all, experts dealing with standard of care. How do you handle that?
Nurses, you get a nurse who is experienced in nursing homes, a nurse who is currently involved and active in a nursing home. They'll speak to the federal regulations that govern nursing homes, the standard of care with regard to treatment of bed sores or fall maintenance and that type of thing. So you rely on the nurses for those issues, and then you rely on a gerontologist, typically a gerontologist in for causation.
Talk about the gerontologist. What kind of, who are these people, where do you find them, and what kind of things do you want them to testify to? These are all MDs, I take it, right?
They're all MDs. I really have used gerontologists from across the country.
Right.
They're not so large in number that you can just find them real easily. You got to hunt for them a bit, but and they speak specifically to causation.
Okay.
And when you're asking about the nursing experts, a lot of times they're the first people that look at the case. You don't go straight to the gerontologist. The nursing experts are the ones that we will get the medical records and send them to them, because if there's no breach in the standard of care, there's probably no reason to go to the second part, to the gerontologist. But they'll look at the charts and they'll say whether or not they feel that the patient got the proper treatment.
Consistent with the federal regulations or with state regulations?
Both.
Both. So do the New Jersey regulations, I know you guys are very Pennsylvania oriented, both of you. But
I am.
Both New Jersey and PA.
Right. So you especially, you're
Right.
Mr. Pennsylvania. But my question is, are the local regulations, do they parallel the federal regulations, or are they more stringent or less stringent? What's the relationship between the two of them?
The local, the New Jersey statute, rights and responsibilities of residents, that incorporates federal regulations. The New Jersey statute really speaks to residents' rights. They're entitled to all sorts of rights, as not having their communications interrupted, to the proper clothing, to visiting rights, to mail, and those types of things, as well as safe, decent environment. And the New Jersey regulations incorporate into it the federal regulations. And then the federal regulations speak more to the standard of care that the nurses need to abide by. I'll have in depositions, I'll make sure to go over the regulations, the federal regulations, what they cover, and that the nursing facility maintains a copy of those regulations, and the nurses are governed by those regulations, and they set the standard of care. And time and again, I get concessions that they do.
Now, how do you value these cases? Because you have someone who has Alzheimer's disease who died as a result of neglect. You might have a difficult time even being able to demonstrate that the person actually was consciously suffering. What is the value of that human life? I'm not talking about punitive damages here. I'm just talking about regular, normal American damages. How do you value these cases?
On pain and suffering.
But what is your proof of that? Especially when your patient's died already. And your patient wouldn't be competent to be a witness anyway.
Well, you've got pain and suffering. You've got the development of a pressure ulcer from its origin, from when it developed, through the 4 stages. And for however long that 4th stage lasts, until presumably the person dies, maybe of the bed sore. You've got the pain and suffering of that. Coupled with that, you use all of those indignity issues to play that, to show those embarrassing, shameful acts that have occurred at the nursing home as leverage to increasing the value of it.
But is that, I mean, again, I don't want to be insensitive here, but when you're dealing with someone who has dementia or someone who has Alzheimer's disease and has died of that pre-trial,
right?
You can't take this person's deposition. You're not going to get any.
I very rarely have the actual resident testify. Very rarely. They're usually already passed, or if they are still alive, they usually have dementia or Alzheimer's.
Right.
But the records, I mean, look, you get the gerontologist to speak to, and the nurse expert to speak to the development of the wound.
Have you ever had, have you had somebody come back to you and say, well, listen, this person was not even aware that he was in pain?
No. Well, they can make that argument.
Would they make that argument to a jury?
Could you make that? I mean, that's a tough
These
argument.
are insurance companies now, remember.
Because a person might not be able to communicate or articulate doesn't mean they can't feel pain. I've got a client right now, I've got a case right now, the resident has passed. The individual had severe Alzheimer's, was borderline comatose. But there is indication throughout that chart that she was continuing to feel pain. And it was a stage 4 bed sore case. I'm very confident that I'll be able to establish pain and suffering in that case.
The other thing is, well, you can establish certain things through the doctor. So you could say to a doctor,
through your expert?
Through your expert, about the levels of pain. But you could also look back in the records and see what kind of medication they were giving the patient to comfort them. Mm-hmm. So if you have somebody who's, even if they have Alzheimer's, that doesn't mean they don't feel pain. But if you see that they're giving them morphine or some kind of heavy medication, you know that they're trying to ease the pain.
Right.
So
there's an inference here that everybody knew this individual was in pain.
Right.
Sure.
But, you know,
you describe what a bed sore is, the gaping wound that craters and goes down to the bone, and let the jury infer.
Just show a picture.
That's going to be,
you show a picture of a wound that's the size of a grapefruit that goes down to the bone or sometimes into the bone.
Right.
I don't think you have to describe the pain and suffering of something like that. I think most people can infer it. The one thing is you have sympathy on your side, and you have the argument that these nursing homes are charging ungodly amounts of money.
That's a punitive issue. That doesn't deal with the economic aspects of this individual. I mean, you really have a person who doesn't have any economic value, and I'm not trying to be insensitive here. I'm just trying to look at it objectively.
That's not. When you say they don't have an economic value, they have non-economic value. They have a value to their family. Mm-hmm. We've had clients who wanted to keep their loved ones alive regardless of what their condition was.
Right.
They believed in the right to life. They believed in the dignity issues and everything else. to them, there was a comfort of knowing that that person that raised them and cared for them was still around, and now it was their job to care for that person and keep them alive. Everybody, it's personal to every person. There are people who feel that, like Dr. Kevorkian, that if the person is suffering, let them go. Mm-hmm. Not everybody feels that way. The loved one might have a living will that says, keep me alive by all means necessary.
And make sure I vote, too.
Well, you got to will them to the polls that way. But there's a value to somebody's life no matter what.
But it's not the same as, I'll take the example of the 36-year-old psychiatrist with 3 little children who's sitting behind the wheel of his car at a traffic light and gets clobbered by somebody and killed, okay? Now you've got a guy that you can actually put a value on his life. You know how much longer he's going to live, you know what his children are, you know what his education is, you know what his expected earnings are. I mean, you have some basis for doing that. That's what makes that a big money case. Here we have somebody who has Alzheimer's disease or dementia, and I understand the emotional component of this, but I'm really kind of trying to approach it from an economic standpoint. How do you value that individual's life?
It's a personalized type thing. Mm-hmm. You appeal to the jury, and I think all the jurors will look at it like, there but for the grace of God go I. What if this was my loved one? What if this was me? How would I feel if my parent was the one in the nursing home who developed the stage 4
But
beds?
what makes it worth X? You're going to suggest something to the jury, you'd sue for a certain amount of money.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
No, you can't sue for any amount of money. You sue.
Okay.
In both
how do you suggest to a jury what a fair verdict would be?
You can't use numbers to say what a fair verdict would be, mm-hmm. but there are ways of appealing to emotion. There are ways of saying, okay, this person suffered for 375 days. Mm-hmm. Each day they woke up and they felt pain for 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day, to the extent that they had to be medicated and on morphine. And you just go through that, and it's the emotion. It's just each individual's feeling of what the value of a case like that is worth.
Do you feel, though, that you could get yourself jammed up with, some type of remediator or something like that, where the judge says, whoa, this is way out of line?
I don't think you're going to get remediator, but you could get, I wouldn't say a pushback, but you could have jurors who say things happen. Mm-hmm. They were old. They were going to die.
Right.
That's always in the back of their mind, too.
Brian, what are your thoughts about all this mess? Do you disagree with us?
Do I disagree? No, I agree with Kevin entirely.
But we value cases very differently. I do more general liability work,
right,
and Brian does exclusively nursing home. So if Brian came to me and talked to me about a fall case, so I would look at person with the age, and let's say I would evaluate it like a slip and fall. So somebody slips and falls, 75 years old, fractured hip, open reduction, internal fixation. Okay, what's the value of that? 175 to 250, right? Brian could then take that, but he's got the extra components on top of that, which the added value. This is a fall down in a nursing home because somebody who was supposed to be taking care of this person didn't. So there's an extra added component to the damages, and that's why his cases are valued differently than my cases with the same type of injury.
Got it. So, just really, you're just appealing to the sympathy, emotion, the type of thing with the jury?
Beyond the pain and suffering that you can establish
right
in the chart. Yes, ultimately, though.
Now, where do you draw the line, though, between, because I'm taking you're going to ask for, you have a punitive damages count here, don't you?
Yes.
So where do you draw the line between the punitive damages component and the sympathy component? It seems to me at some point they're going to blend into each other.
They do. They do often blend into one another.
Yet you're going to be asking for separate verdicts in each one of these things, right?
Yes.
So we have the emotional component on the regular damages part.
Right.
I know you're going to talk about profits.
Yes. Failure to manage.
Failure to manage.
Intentional or knowingly.
Oh boy, intentionals. At the end of the day, you guys need a really, really good jury, right? Do you agree?
Do you need a really, really good jury? I mean, I think you need a fair-minded group of people.
Okay. So, who are you looking for? What types of people? Who do you want to try this case to? How educated do they have to be? How old do they have to be? What race or cultural background do they have to be?
It's
What are you
case
looking
by
for?
case.
Huh?
I mean, there are certain types of individuals I might try to avoid, but it's a case-by-case analysis.
All right, let's get this on the table right off. We don't want any accountants. Now let's move on.
I mean,
No
I
engineers. Right?
would look for people in probably their mid-50s and up,
Right.
because I'd be looking for somebody who can relate to the patient, somebody who may have a parent or a grandparent who was in a nursing home.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wouldn't want to have a 20-year-old on my jury.
50 or up, you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good measure. I mean, I just would stay away from the younger individuals. I mean, 30s, 40s.
Now, do you attempt in going through your jury selection to find individuals to whom you're going to try your case individually? And by that I mean, you're saying to yourself, this is going to be an influential juror. This is an alpha male. This is a natural leader. This is somebody who I think, if I could persuade this person, could bring the rest of the jury along with me. I mean, do you try to really kind of pare the jury down so that you have individuals you think that will be your advocates in the jury room?
Yes.
And how do you do that?
I'm always looking for a leader.
How do you do it?
Based upon the...
Is it just something you do instinctively?
Yeah, it
after
is.
doing it for so long?
It is instinctive. You know, you go through the voir dire process and you listen to the way, I mean, just how they come in and they present initially.
Mm-hmm.
They come to sidebar, they walk in, how do they answer their questions? A lot of people, I mean, they're met with a judge and some attorneys sitting in a room, and they have to start answering questions. We'll be quiet, we'll be reserved. This is new territory for them. You get someone that comes in there and speaks with confidence out of the gate. I think you got a good chance to get your lead.
Extroverted person.
Yeah, extroverted. Someone who's going to take charge.
Okay.
Now that person has to have to do two things. They have to take charge the right way.
Right.
That's what you got to be looking for.
You find that these cases are won primarily in jury selection, in the sense that the success of your case is really going to be a function of the jury that you select. Would you say that that's true? And I don't want to put words in your mouth. I mean, you're the one who does this, and I'm trying to kind of get an idea for the attorneys who are watching of how critical jury selection is in these types of cases.
It is critical. I think it's critical in every case. Mm-hmm. So do I think... I think there's a good argument to be made that in these cases that the selection of your jury is just
the problem in the nursing home case, from my perspective, though, it's an extremely nuanced practice because you have enormous amounts of money at stake. You have very, very sympathetic people, but again, the argument can be made that their economic, value, so to speak, you can't reduce it to some type of formula like you can in the case of the psychiatrist I was telling you about. So you really have to have jurors that are going to be able to buy into that and understand it and do what's fair and do what's right, But who's to say what's right, How do you value these cases? How much, when you look at it, it's such an unpredictable endeavor. How do you value the case? What do you do?
I take a look at the injury and I make, I have an experience based upon certain injuries, what general value is.
Right.
So I'm governed by that usually, and then we look at what's going on in each individual case and how much is there to generate risk.
Do you find that your adversaries, be it the insurance company or the nursing home itself, they generally have the same experience you do in terms of what these cases are worth? In other words, they know what their exposure is to as a practical matter? Yeah,
I mean, I typically see them coming in right around the same place generally with cases when they want to settle them earlier. When they value them a little more, I know the next general level where they're going to. Right. So what's the case you want to take to trial every time? Case I want to take to trial every time. Even if they offered you the policy? Even if they offered the policy. Stage 4 bed sore case with hygiene issues. Right. With a good family.
And a good former employee.
A good former employee.
Good former employee who tells you that the facility wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing. They were understaffed. They weren't turning the patients. They weren't doing all these things.
Yeah, you got a problematic facility, you got a former 2, you got a good family, and you got a stage 4.
Okay.
They're in good shape.
So you're going to try that. They're going to surrender the policy, and you're going to say no. We're going to trial.
I would be willing to,
Okay.
under the right circumstances.
You agree?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, is that fair to the family?
That's
put
the
them through
family.
this?
Well, that's the family's choice ultimately, right? I mean, that's conversation among counsel, and they make their decision.
Right.
But I'll tell you, you get family members who come in angry and remain angry the entire time, and they just want to hold their feet to the fire.
Right.
And I've had them. Some change. Some of it comes simply about the money and let's get the. And sometimes it's a long road for family members. Sometimes they want to be done with it. But you get those, and it's the right circumstances.
What happens, though, Brian, when you have a situation where your client has passed on? Now you're dealing with an estate and maybe a surviving spouse or not. I mean, how does all this change? I mean, you have intestacy issues as well, and other family members popping up out of the woodwork. Does these things happen to you?
I really have not run into that very often in terms of infighting or anything like that.
Right, that's what I'm trying to say.
No, I'll tell you, most of my cases, there is not a will.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get an administrator or an administratrix appointed.
Got it.
The family's usually cooperative in that regard. They just choose one to be the leader.
Do you find there's a surviving spouse frequently or infrequently?
Less frequently.
Okay.
I have them, but less frequently. It's usually the kids.
Now, you've been doing this a long time, and I guess the question I want to ask you, so people who have an idea that they want to get involved in this is a hyper-technical field of law. How long had you been doing this before you started feeling really comfortable with it?
It takes a good number of years to be doing it. There's so much that you have to learn. You have to learn how to take on that chart and understand all the medical jargon and be familiar and comfortable with the medical chart. You have to learn the regulations. So it takes a number of years
Right.
to really, depending on how much time you're going to be able to put into it. Now, I got involved and I started doing this 24/7.
Right.
When I just didn't dabble in a couple of cases. I got a bunch of cases thrown my way, and I was helping out with other cases. So I was doing it. That was my entire practice, and has been since then. And it's taking years.
I guess what I'm trying to suggest is this: that if you're a young attorney out there and one of these cases falls into your lap, do not try this at home. Okay? There's just too much going on here. You don't have the perspective on how much the case is worth. You don't know how to value it. And what might be a lot of money to you initially and to your client and client's family may not be anywhere near what the case is worth, especially if it's worked up. And you don't know also, I mean, you may not be trained enough to know
What you don't know.
what you don't know, exactly.
Right.
So you've really kind of got to go to people like you and have you guys take a look at it. And if you're going to do this, that's fine, but have somebody help you through the first half dozen cases, okay? Till you really get your feet wet, because there is a substantial learning curve in these cases. Would you agree?
I do.
So you think the best thing to do is come and see you?
Absolutely. Go to the nursinghomeattorneys.com or to our website.
Okay.
We're putting it on the screen right now.
Okay.
Along with your phone number. Okay. So anybody who wants to get a hold of you guys are going to be able to do it. It's just important that I don't think young, inexperienced attorneys, even people who are plaintiffs' attorneys, experienced plaintiffs' attorneys should be doing this on their own. They really need somebody to come in with them on it.
Definitely.
Well, once again, we've put your contact information on the bottom of the screen here so that the attorneys out there, normally I would say what's the best thing you can do is if you're an attorney who has one of these cases, call you, Brian. And if you're not there, speak to Kevin.
That's right.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating CLE, and boy, I feel old today.